How could a queen be remembered as a child eater? The name Margaret of Anjou still drifts through history, not with the grace of a noblewoman, but with the shadows of horror. Chroniclers whispered of her as a monster, a woman who prowled battlefields and feasted on innocence. The image is grotesque, a royal figure framed against the smoke of war, her dress splattered with blood, her eyes fixed not on crowns or treaties, but on children. Soldiers swore they saw her lead troops into carnage, her presence more terrifying than steel itself. Mothers prayed their sons would never cross her path, for the legend claimed she carried the hunger of a beast. But was it truth? Or was it the sharpest weapon her enemies ever forged? England in the 15th century was not only torn apart by the clash of armies, but also by the clash of stories. To brand a queen as the child-eating queen was to strip her of humanity, to turn politics into myth. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, was educated, intelligent, and politically astute. Yet history dressed her in the rags of a savage. The paradox is haunting. How could a queen raised in courts of refinement be remembered in the language of nightmares? How could a woman who fought to protect her son be condemned as a devourer of children? This is the riddle we must unravel. Behind every smear lies a motive. Behind every myth lies a deeper fear. Tonight, we walk through the battlefield fog where blood and legend mix, where truth and slander blur, and where Margaret's name was turned into a curse. Was she truly a monster, or simply the victim of history's cruelest propaganda? Stay with this story until the very end, and if you wish to keep uncovering the hidden, forbidden truths of royal history, remember to subscribe to this channel so you never miss what lies beneath the crown. Margaret of Anjou was born in March 1430 in the castle of Pont-à-Mousson, nestled within the Duchy of Lorraine. Her father was René of Anjou, known as the Good King René, a man of many titles but little power, while her mother Isabella of Lorraine carried the strength of a family accustomed to survival in a Europe fractured by war. Though her father's crowns were often more ceremonial than real, Margaret grew up surrounded by the culture of courts, by poetry, politics, and the delicate art of negotiation. From the beginning, she learned that survival in noble circles demanded more than birthright. It demanded presence, intelligence, and the ability to bend perception itself. She came of age during a period when France and England were still locked in the long shadow of the 100 Years' War. The Treaty of Troyes, the claims of kings across borders, and the blood spilled between them had created not only armies on the battlefield, but also marriages arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Margaret's destiny was no exception. At the age of 15, she was chosen as the bride for Henry VI of England. The marriage was not born out of love, but out of calculation. For England's fragile king, a French bride symbolized the hope of peace, or at least a pause in generations of conflict. Henry VI was a man of piety and bookish nature, but ill-suited for the ruthless demands of kingship. Those around him believed that a queen strong enough, politically astute enough, might steady the crown. Margaret was young, yet her reputation for intelligence had already crossed borders. When she sailed to England in 1445 to marry Henry, she carried not only her trousseau, but also the expectations of two kingdoms. The people who lined the streets of London to greet her saw a figure of youth and grace, but they could not imagine the burdens she would be forced to carry. The political arrangement of her marriage was controversial from the very beginning. The Treaty of Tours, which accompanied the wedding, demanded that England return the territory of Maine to France. Many English nobles were outraged. To them, This was not the gift of peace, but the betrayal of hard-won soil. Margaret, still a teenager, was thrust into a storm of resentment. Before she even learned the language of her new country, she had already been painted by some as the symbol of loss. Yet Margaret did not shrink from her role. Where Henry appeared indecisive, Margaret projected clarity. Where he leaned toward passivity, she showed determination. Her French upbringing had taught her to see beyond the pageantry of court, to understand the pulse of power. Soon, courtiers realized she was not content to remain a silent partner at Henry's side. She spoke with authority, argued with conviction, and positioned herself as more than the king's wife. She sought to embody the very spine of the monarchy at a time when that spine was beginning to crack. The English court was a cauldron of ambition. Powerful nobles circled the throne, each one measuring how much influence he could wrest from a king who rarely fought for his own. In this vacuum, Margaret became both a target and a necessity. Her youth might have seemed a weakness, but it granted her a clarity that the older lords underestimated. She knew that if she did not claim space for herself, others would claim it over her. Slowly, she built alliances, while her enemies whispered that she meddled too boldly, that she was a French woman meddling in English affairs. It was in these years that Margaret began to take on the role that history would later remember with such distortion. She was no longer simply the queen consort. She was the living emblem of the Lancastrian claim. Every gesture, every word she spoke in defense of her husband and her son became political. She was not a background figure. She was a participant in the very struggle for the English throne. And yet, the foundation beneath her feet was never solid. Henry's reign was already faltering. His mind, fragile and unpredictable, left gaps that could not be concealed. Into those gaps stepped Margaret, not out of choice but out of necessity. As the storm clouds of civil war began to gather, it was she who would hold the banner, she who would lead, and she who would be cursed for her strength. The rise of Margaret of Anjou was not the story of a woman grasping greedily at power. It was the story of a queen stepping into a void left by a king unable to rule. That act would place her forever in the center of one of England's bloodiest conflicts, and it would be the spark that gave birth to the legend which would soon turn her from a woman into a monster. England descended into chaos as the Wars of the Roses erupted, a civil conflict that turned village against village and split families down to their very bloodline. On battlefields from St. Albans to Wakefield, banners of red and white cut across the sky like torn fabric, each clash drenching the soil in deeper shades of scarlet. In these moments, Margaret of Anjou became more than a queen. She became a figure whispered about in both fear and awe, a shadow that lingered in the smoke long after swords were lowered. Contemporary accounts describe her as a constant presence, not wielding the blade herself, but orchestrating those who did. Chroniclers hostile to her claimed she encouraged ruthless tactics, that she urged soldiers to show no mercy. They wrote of her as if she were a general cloaked in royal silk, her commands sharper than steel. Whether she was truly present on every battlefield hardly mattered. What mattered was that her enemies needed her image to be there, looming behind every act of violence. This was how the legend grew, in pamphlets, in gossip, in the campfire tales of weary men. Margaret was transformed into a figure of terror. The Yorkists began to call her the she-wolf of France, a name that tore away her humanity and replaced it with something primal. In their words, she stalked the fields like a predator, her eyes fixed on blood rather than peace. One story claimed she watched laughing as prisoners were cut down. Another, that she demanded the death of innocents to quench her rage. None of these were proven, yet they spread faster than any messenger could ride. To a population desperate for explanations, these stories found fertile ground. How else could they understand the rivers of blood that now ran through England? How else to explain the collapse of order, except to place blame on a woman foreign by birth and fearless in resolve? Margaret was not only an enemy, she was foreign. And in that foreignness her detractors saw license to paint her with monstrous strokes. Her actual role was far less theatrical but no less significant. She negotiated alliances, rallied loyal lords, and sought to preserve her son's inheritance. Yet in the eyes of her enemies, these acts became proof of unnatural ambition. In a society that expected queens to embody silence and obedience, Margaret's defiance was rewritten as bloodlust. Her face became the mask of Lancaster, and that mask was smeared with every atrocity of the war. The horror was not confined to the battlefield. Songs sung in taverns described her as a witch who thrived on screams, while broadsheets warned that even children were not safe from her hunger. Mothers told their little ones to behave, or Queen Margaret would come for them. A real woman, flesh and bone, was being erased before the eyes of her contemporaries, replaced with a legend too monstrous to forget. War devoured truth just as it devoured bodies. In the ashes of villages and the silence of ruined fields, Margaret's reputation became another casualty. The queen who sought to hold her family's throne was remembered not for her courage or her relentless defense of her son, but for a myth darker than night. By the time the Roses had drawn the kingdom into years of slaughter, Margaret of Anjou was no longer merely a queen. She was the phantom that haunted the Yorkists' nightmares. The she-wolf they claimed had unleashed the fury of civil war itself. History would never again see her as the girl from Anjou who married a king. It would remember the legend of a monster born in battle. Margaret of Anjou's path through the Wars of the Roses was not only carved by swords, but by the slow erosion of trust. The lords who once raised their banners for Lancaster began to falter. Some defected outright to the House of York. Others clung to her court with the smile of loyalty while feeding her enemies information. Betrayal became as common as bread. Each oath she received was suspect, each alliance provisional. The queen who had once rallied armies now walked through a landscape of shifting allegiances where every hand might hold a dagger. What held her together in this storm was not the crumbling authority of her husband, but the beating heart of her son, Edward of Westminster, the sole prince of Lancaster, grew into the center of her world. Margaret's devotion to him was absolute. She carried him into councils, displayed him before allies, reminded every wavering noble that the boy embodied the future of their house. To Margaret, he was both her child and her cause. Yet what she held as sacred, her enemies twisted into blasphemy. Rumors claimed she guarded Edward with sorcery, that her maternal protection masked rituals too vile to name. Whisperers accused her of stealing the lifeblood of innocence, feeding on the young so her son might thrive. These were not reports from the field, but stories crafted in the shadows of propaganda. A woman who fought for her child was painted as a monster who consumed children. What should have been her most human quality became the cornerstone of her legend as a witch and a devourer. This was the cruel genius of her enemies. To attack her as a strategist might only strengthen her reputation. To depict her as inhuman robbed her of sympathy and placed her outside the bounds of mercy. The name She-Wolf of France was joined with darker whispers, and her image spread across taverns and marketplaces as the very embodiment of cruelty. Peasants who had never seen her face came to fear her like a phantom. Mothers quieted their children with warnings that Queen Margaret would take them if they disobeyed. Meanwhile, betrayal thinned her circle. Some of her closest allies defected after Lancastrian defeats. Others simply abandoned her cause to preserve their lands. She was left to face not only the armies of York, but the silence of her own dwindling support. Each failure deepened her isolation until she seemed to stand alone, a woman encircled by men who measured loyalty in coin rather than conviction. And still she pressed forward. For her son, she endured the humiliation of begging for aid from foreign courts, the exhaustion of ceaseless flight, the bitterness of broken promises. Chroniclers who despised her turned these sacrifices into further proof of villainy. They claimed she would stop at nothing, that she bartered away souls for soldiers, that she clung to Edward's future with claws rather than arms. The truth was far simpler and more human. Margaret was a mother who would not surrender her child's inheritance, even when the crown crumbled in her hands. But history rarely preserves simplicity. It preserves spectacle. And so her image hardened into that of a sorceress, a woman whose maternal devotion was reframed as demonic hunger. She was no longer only the she-wolf. She was recast as a witch who consumed youth to keep her son's claim alive. This was the price of power for Margaret of Anjou. Not the wealth she never secured, nor the lands that slipped from her grasp, but her very humanity, stripped away and replaced with legend. In defending her son, she lost herself to the imagination of her enemies. The woman disappeared. The myth endured. The wheel of fortune that once lifted Margaret of Anjou turned with cold resolve. At Towton in 1461, the snow and the steel swallowed the Lancastrian cause. When the field fell silent, Edward of York claimed the crown. From that day, the ground under Margaret's feet did not hold. Castles that had flown the red rose opened their gates to the new power. Old promises softened into careful smiles. Messages arrived with delays and excuses. She learned to read hesitation as clearly as ink. She moved because stillness was dangerous. Scotland offered shelter for a time. France offered audiences and guarded sympathy. In hidden English roads, she gathered men and coin where she could. Through every appeal, one purpose did not bend. Her son Edward of Westminster remained the pulse of her struggle. She stood him before allies so that they would see the future with their own eyes. In private, she measured every risk against a single question. Would it keep him safe and keep his claim alive? Defeat did not drown the stories. It fed them. The same mouths that had called her a wolf now called her a spirit. If cattle vanished or prisoners were slain, her name was stitched into the tale. A queen without an army becomes a shadow very quickly. Mothers quieted their children with warnings that required no proof. In markets and taverns, she was no longer a woman, but a shape that moved in the dark. For a moment, the wheel rose. In 1470, Henry VI returned to the throne in a fragile restoration. The corridors remembered the sound of old footsteps, but the echo was thin. The realm was only pausing. When Margaret landed in 1471, the reckoning waited. At Tewkesbury, the banners closed upon one another, and the lines bent and broke. When the dust settled, Edward of Westminster lay among the fallen. Some said he died in the crush. Others said he was taken and struck afterward. The versions differ because grief is never precise. The fact is plain. The prince was dead at 17. Capture followed. She walked as a prisoner through streets that searched her face for the monster they had been promised. They did not find it. They found a woman made pale by loss, who placed one foot before the other because there was nothing else to do. Chroniclers loyal to the new order did not draw her as a mother in mourning. They drew a figure drained of life who drifted through corridors like a whisper. Years of confinement hardened into a quiet routine. She was held in England and then ransomed to France. News reached her that Henry had died in the Tower. With husband gone and son gone and crown erased, the titles that once weighed on her shoulders felt like garments that no longer fit. She lived in rooms where light crossed stone slowly, and memory arrived without invitation. The legend did not fade with distance. It thickened. The queen who walked mourning halls became a sign that others could use. If a harvest failed, or a lord lost favor, or a soldier dreamed of blood, the tale reached for the same name. Margaret became less a person than a sentence that people spoke when they wanted fear to do the work of argument. Here the contrast cuts clear. There is Margaret, the woman who loved a single child and carried his claim through hunger and flight. There is Margaret, the phantom, who existed only to explain the ruin of a kingdom to those who needed a shape for their anger. One life moved along roads and through rooms. The other drifted across pages and songs. Isolation and defeat did not end her story. They made it useful to others. In that usefulness, her humanity was pressed flat, and the legend remained. In the end, Margaret of Anjou did not fall with a sword in her hand or a crown on her head. She faded into the quiet corridors of France, far from the English throne that had consumed her life. After her ransom, she was allowed to return to the land of her birth. No longer a queen in power, but a widow in all but name, a mother whose son lay in foreign soil. She settled first in the court of her relatives, then in smaller estates, the great retinue of a royal household reduced to a handful of attendants. The years passed slowly. She was no longer the fiery figure who had rallied armies or faced jeering crowds. Those who saw her in France spoke of a woman worn by grief. Her face lined not only by age but by memory. She lived quietly, dependent on the charity of her family and the remnants of her dowry. The echoes of war reached her ears, but they were distant now, muffled by the walls of her modest rooms. Where once she had commanded halls filled with lords and soldiers, she now walked through gardens with only silence for company. Yet even as her days emptied into obscurity, her name lived with a life of its own across the Channel. In England, the legend had hardened. To many, she was not an aging exile, but the phantom that had haunted their civil war. Chroniclers repeated the stories of the she-wolf, of the witch who had destroyed innocence, of the queen who had feasted on the blood of children. They did not describe her final years of quiet isolation. They preserved the monster they had invented, because monsters are more memorable than widows in forgotten rooms. Margaret died in August of 1482 in Anjou, far from the land where she had fought and lost everything. Her death was unremarkable, without drama, without the thunder of armies or the cries of courtiers. There was no husband at her side, no son to mourn her, no throne to claim her. She left the world as an old woman who had once carried crowns and now carried only memories. Yet her death, though ordinary, could not cleanse the stain that propaganda had left upon her. History often chooses spectacle over truth. In the case of Margaret of Anjou, it remembered not her years of exile or her quiet end, but the shadow it had cast upon her. She was recalled not as the daughter of Anjou or the queen of Henry VI, but as the child-eating queen. The contradiction is stark. A woman who died in silence was remembered as a beast. A queen who once loved fiercely was reduced to a nightmare told in chronicles and songs. The legend endured because it served a purpose. It gave England a villain for a war that had no heroes. It allowed victors to explain the rivers of blood by pointing to a single face. It turned defeat into a story of triumph over evil. And in that story, Margaret's humanity vanished. The truth of her life, her grief, her final years in the quiet of France, slipped into the margins while the myth marched on. Her body rests in earth, but her ghost belongs to memory. Not the ghost of her soul, but the ghost that history itself created. A queen transformed into a curse, a mother remembered as a monster, a woman erased by legend. Margaret of Anjou's death was ordinary, but the shadow that followed her was anything but. Margaret of Anjou's life ended in silence, but her memory never faded. She was buried in France as an aging exile, yet England carried her name like a wound. What survived was not the woman who suffered loss, but the figure her enemies had crafted. This choice tells us more about how history is written than about Margaret herself. The victors of the Wars of the Roses needed an explanation for decades of bloodshed. Rather than admit that ambition and betrayal tore the kingdom apart, they pointed to a single woman, Margaret's foreign birth. Her sharp will and her refusal to be silent made her the perfect target. To blame her was to simplify chaos. A nation could believe that the rivers of blood were the price of one queen's ambition rather than the cost of a fractured realm. Once a rumor becomes legend, it gains a life of its own. Margaret was remembered not as a mother who defended her son, but as a monster who consumed innocence. That story was easier to repeat than the truth. A quiet widow in France inspires little fear. A phantom queen who feasted on children lingers in memory for centuries. This distortion was not unique to her. Many powerful women were reshaped by history into warnings rather than examples. Eleanor of Aquitaine was accused of corruption and manipulation, though she built courts of culture. Mary I of England was reduced to Bloody Mary, her policies and struggles forgotten in favor of a single fearful title. Margaret of Anjou joined them, transformed into a nightmare because she dared to step into the arena of power. Her legacy, therefore, is twofold. She remains a symbol of Lancaster's fall, but also a lesson in how easily truth is buried beneath story. The chronicles preserved the mask, not the face. Students reading about her often meet the legend before they meet the woman. She is remembered more vividly than kings who ruled longer, because fear outlives reason. The contrast is stark. Her death was ordinary, a life ending in exile, yet her reputation is extraordinary, a myth that refused to die. Margaret's humanity was forgotten so that the legend could endure. This is how memory works. It chooses spectacle over silence, monsters over mothers. Perhaps this is why her story still matters. Margaret forces us to question what we accept as history. Who benefits when a queen becomes a monster? Whose voice is erased when propaganda becomes truth? These questions linger beyond her grave. If you have followed Margaret's journey from her rise to her fall, you have walked with both the woman and the phantom, to keep uncovering such buried truths, to challenge the legends that still haunt the past. Stay with us. Like this video, share it with those who seek the real faces behind crowns, and subscribe so that together we can continue to bring forgotten voices back into the light.